Welcome to But Is It Feminist, the podcast that supports women's rights and women's wrongs. I am your host, Amanda Hernandez, sociologist by training, hater by nature. Today, I am excited and nervous to dive into a topic where I know people just have so many opinions. I'm talking about smut books, romantasy, dark romance of book talk. About 2 years ago, I was gateway drugged by A Court of Thorns and Roses, or the ACOTAR series, and since then I have read my fair share of books in this genre. I come to this conversation knowing full well that there is a spectrum of interpretation on this body of literature, no pun intended, and I thought I should bring in an expert. That is Sonia. Sonia Del Hierro earned her PhD at Rice University and is an assistant professor of literature at Southwestern University. And ultimately, I think these credentials will be extremely helpful as we come to a verdict on whether or not books about dragons who fuck is feminist or not. Sonia, thank you for being here. And will you please introduce yourself?
Thank you so much. What a beautiful, funny opening. My name is Sonia. I specialize in Mexican American literature, actually, all of which are incredibly serious, incredibly intense novels. I love books. I think that's probably what I'll just introduce myself here as. I've been an avid reader since I was in my teens. I have always loved romance books in particular. I love love. And I always loved the romance plot lines within very serious books. I remember reading Barbara Kingsolver's The Poisonwood Bible, a very good, very serious book about colonialism. And two characters kind of fall in love. And I remember reading it yay.
Are you the meme of the reels on Instagram where it's like, I stayed up till 2 a.m. and they finally held hands, and it's like giggle feet.
That is me kicking my feet.
Do you recall as a teenager the first romance book you read, or first romance you remember that struck you?
That's a great question. I read Hawk Song by Amelia Atwater Rhodes I must have been middle school or high school. And it's a young adult fantasy that is romantic. It's the forced marriage plot line.
Okay.
Which I have all these terms now to describe the romance genre that I didn't have, but I fell in love with it and I have all the series now. And it was so exciting to read about love in this high fantasy way. Maybe I shouldn't use high fantasy because that gets into a whole genre.
We don't want to get hate
on high low fantasy. But I think Hawk Song was one of my early kind of introductions that I was just really struck. And it's one of those feelings of you're reading a book and when you walk away from it to do chores or to go to school or something, I would be thinking of it or feeling that pull to go back into the world. When you're watching a TV show and you're kind of obsessed with it, and you're all I want to be doing right now is watching the show. That's how I would feel about the books that I was reading. I wanted to be in there. And then sometimes I felt like I would just walk around in a daze, just thinking about the characters and the world around them and the love between them.
That's one of my favorite feelings of getting so immersed in the world an author has created that you want to go there. You want to be there. Your thoughts are with the characters. I posted them, and my brain is just memes. I'm so sorry. I had posted something on Instagram the other day. It was like, are you okay? Is one of you, it was from The Simpsons. It was like, is one of your fictional characters having issues? Yes.
Yes, Lisa Simpson. I am also Lisa.
I'm very excited to keep going further into this conversation. Obviously, we cannot even stop ourselves. But before we get further into it, I would like us to start with what many a feminist before us has done by defining our terms. So how would you define feminism, and tell us a little bit about how you came to be a feminist?
Of course. So this is a difficult question, but one I've answered in a lot of different ways. To me, feminism is a liberatory framework that values equity and equality for all people, but especially for oppressed or marginalized people. Came to feminism probably in graduate school is when I started embracing the term and saying I am a feminist. And it's there that I learned kind of this feminist history that you actually covered in your earlier podcast episodes about how white feminism was kind of the dominant framework for a very long time. And even after white women defined and operated feminism in a kind of domineering way, then it became about essentialist women, right? Women who were born in a certain way, and thinking that womanhood is kind of like a biological
Mm.
kind of aspect of our lives rather than some kind of constructed gender. And I think what I found my way to is this idea that there's like a well-known quote, the personal is political, and also no one is free until we're all free. And I think for me, this is what makes feminism, it's what defines feminism for me. It's what makes it valuable and still have some kind of non-financial currency for
Mm.
me to hold on to and to use in my everyday life. And I think the way I came to it before graduate school, before I felt like I could claim this word, which was very intimidating word for me,
Yeah.
was because my mom would have never called herself a feminist, but she was radical in a lot of different ways. First of all, she was like she was a huge advocate for financial independence, which if we look at the waves is very like second wave feminist, to be a laborer, to be a worker, for women to be laborers and workers and heads of households. And also, my aunts, my tias, were also what I would say, like maybe not proto feminism, but a kind of feminism that has all of the concepts, but not the label.
Yeah.
And it was always a lot of times through sexism, through this idea that men only valued women for sex, and that was something that they were very vocal about. A lot of the ways I learned about sex was through them telling me, like, that's all that men want, stuff like that.
Interesting.
And and also through racism, I think now we have this term intersectionality. I didn't know that till graduate school either, but my tias and my mom were constantly calling out racism. They lived in a era that was, in rural Texas, where there would be signs outside of restaurants that said, no Mexicans or blacks or dogs allowed and stuff like that. And so they had endured explicit over oppressive racism. And in calling that out, I think it's a proto feminist kind of idea.
So you have a podcast that you've worked on, and I'm wondering if
Mhm.
you can just give us like a 2-3 sentence sort of elevator pitch of what you and your colleagues talk about on that.
Yeah. So everybody's doing podcasts these days.
Uh,
My podcast is Senora Power, and it traces a kind of lineage or genealogy of women of Mexican descent who are either immigrants or they were born in the US. And they are considered senoras either through age, marriage, or the respect that they've garnered from their communities, their Mexican American communities. And we try to highlight the ways that power is sort of mobilized through this identity of senora.
I love that. I could not have
Yeah.
picked a better person to come talk about this. You like, your background, everything you research, everything you are, like, you've laid such a good framework for us to think about something we all love. Well, maybe not everybody, but we should. So in the romantasy smut genre, what have you read? Do you have a favorite?
Yes. So when you asked me to do this podcast, I took like an inventory. I looked through my Goodreads. I looked through my Storygraph,
You
like
have 'em
through my
all.
bookshelves. I was, yeah, well, I don't actually. What I learned in kind of reviewing my reading history is that I've actually only read maybe under 10 romantasy smut books.
Okay.
Which is like not a lot, honestly, because it's a huge genre. It's like ever growing. And so the main ones that I've read are, I was also gateway drug. I wasn't gateway drugged, but I was told to read Sarah Moss's The Court of Thorns and Roses,
Mhm.
and I read all of those. I have them all, and I really enjoyed them while I was reading them. We can talk about critiques that we have now. But I've also read Rebecca Yaros's Fourth Wing, and the sequel, and I'm just starting the third one.
Okay.
I also really got into Greek mythology romantasies, particularly around
Fine.
Hades and Persephone is like a
Mhm.
story that I love retellings of. And so Sasha Summers and Rachel Alexander both have like some series with Hades and Persephone that are really excellent. You, of course, told me about Lindsay Straub's. I should call it The Kiss of the Basilisk, but when you gave it to me, it was Split or Swallow, which is about serpents, snakes. Probably one of a kind in many ways. And I also wanted, before I get to my favorite, wanted to shout out the first ever romantasy I got is I ever read. I must have been about 15. Rebecca York's New Moon. It's a werewolf romantasy with mates. I don't think it's quite like Omega verse Alpha, but it's definitely like mated werewolf genre. And my cousins were having, I have two older cousins. They're both unmarried, no children. And they were had a garage sale when I was a teenager, and they were selling a bunch of stuff. And this was there. And I don't think my mom realized like how explicit it was, because she would have never allowed me to get it if she did. But I absolutely fell in love with it at like 15, 16. I even shared it with all of my friends. And I also just love the way that like stories get told and passed down. And this is like a physical kind of example of that. But my favorite is Ali Hazelwood's Bride. I don't know if you've read that. It came out maybe 2 or 3 years ago. But it's a werewolf vampire romantasy love book. And I absolutely love Ali Hazelwood's like realism romance. And so Bride is like absolutely fantastic.
Okay, I have not read Bride, and I see the cover a lot, like at the library
Yeah.
or bookstores or on Book Talk, but I did not realize it fit into the romantasy genre, and
Mhm.
I'm immediately like, I'm like, okay, I need to read New Moon by Rebecca York. Okay, I need to read Bride. But can you give us like a quick synopsis of Bride? We got vampire, werewolf.
Yeah.
Is it like a forbidden love type story?
It's a forbidden love. It's also I it's hard to talk about books without spoiling it because there is like a mated kind of situation.
Okay.
The main character is a vampire and the main love interest is a werewolf, and they're in a forced marriage scenario situation. And I love this book because it's not often that you see humans as not the main characters. Like we often
Mhm.
as humans write about humans, and that's the primary mode that we tell stories, but this one has really one main human character, and she's like not in most of the book. Like I'd say like 90% of the book she's not in. And so it's really a really great sort of exploration of two different species that have their own different worlds. And I also this is not part of the synopsis, but it's a great kind of exploration of the genre because the main character like absolutely adores or the main male character absolutely adores the main female character, and but like still doesn't want to take away her freedom and is like respecting her consent, which we can get into. But this is like a great example of what like I think contemporary romantasy looks like.
I'm so excited to read it immediately on my top of my to-do list.
You will not regret it. It's so good.
I can't imagine a scenario where I would. My goodness. So, I have heard lots of different takes on why women love this genre so much. And even as you were talking, I was thinking of more things possibly, but the one I hear a lot is people say it's essentially porn for women that centers women's pleasure and agency. And I'm wondering if you think that's an accurate read on the love for this genre.
I think that is one accurate read. I think there, as you already kind of gestured to, there are many ways that we can answer this question, and they all kind of overlap. But to me, I think they all center satisfaction,
Mm.
which is a part of porn, right?
Yeah.
And pleasure and agency. But to begin in different ways, I think that satisfaction can be derived from happy endings and from like the romance, even romance comedy genre. And there's something about us humans that love a happy ending. Not everybody, because I think that that's why some people really don't like it, because the happy endings are too predictable, or they're too nice, or they're too something, right?
Yeah.
Um, but I think that there's a satisfaction in knowing that at the end of the romantasy, you might have a cliffhanger, right? But for the most part, the two main characters will have some kind of conclusion that gives you satisfaction. I think there's also satisfaction in this idea of mates that probably have a lot to do with our more spiritual idea of soulmates.
Hmm.
And it's very satisfying to think to imagine and fantasize that a very powerful character, whether he's a human or a werewolf or a vampire or a fairy or a dragon or a snake, powerful, and he has chosen this character, this other character to adore and to love and to cherish. That's satisfying, I think. And it in that way it plays out all these scenarios and fantasies, and I think even like moral quandaries. Like I think
Yeah.
it's also trying to think about, where do our ethics lie? And it's a very low stakes way of doing it, right? Like they're not looking for Pulitzer Nobel Prizes when they're publishing stuff like this. And instead, it's more low stakes, like what can we explore here? What boundaries can we push? And where does that lead us to? How do we feel about that? And then I think, going back to your initial question, one way that this genre centers satisfaction is that it is pleasurable, and it's trying to kind of shirk off the shame that a lot of women feel around sex and around pleasure. And I think it has a lot to do with the sexual liberation and revolution of the 1970s that we're still kind of wrestling with and attempting to uphold and continue progressing with. And it made me think of, and now of course, I'm going to forget her name, but is it Adrienne Marie Brown, who writes about pleasure activism?
I think so. Yeah.
Right. And so she writes about the way that to have pleasure is to inform your activism, because you're kind of working against this idea that we are all miserable, that we're all sort of destined for this 9 to 5 that's unending, that it's just like this pushback on a more oppressive kind of daily living. But I think not all of these are doing pleasure activism. And I'm also thinking Audre Lorde has the essay, The Uses of the Erotic, right? And it's about how when we make connections between each other that are sexual and that are erotic, it's kind of untouchable by an oppressive regime, by an institution. It's something
Mhm.
that we hold together between each other as a community. It doesn't even have to be individual. And so that's, I think, pleasure activism. And some of these have those, but not all of them.
Can you think of one that you feel does it well, and then one that you're like, absolutely the fuck not? No.
mm, I don't think that A Court of Roses and Thorns is pleasure activism, but I do think that you could probably read. I mean, maybe because it's my favorite, I'm biased, but I think you could read Bride as this sort of anti-oppressive, pleasurable activist work, but I'm not sure.
Okay, so I'm gonna insert here spoiler alerts because I need you to elaborate on both of these. So
Mhm.
We're giving Sonia free reign to talk about any and all plot points. So if you have not read either book and you are concerned about spoilers, stop listening. Come back when you've read them. Okay, Sonia, so yes, I need you to elaborate on both. So tell us, we'll start with A Court of Thorns and Roses. What about the book and the series make it fit into that category of this is not pleasure activism for you?
Because I think that A Court of Thorns and Roses is very invested in a rags to kind of riches story that's very individual based. It has this young woman who is poor, and who you could read as like lower working class if we were to add a Marxist lens. And then she gets raised all the way to the most powerful queen of all the land in its
The
most
queen of
simple
the night,
version.
high lady of the night court.
Hi, lady. Thank you. So in its most diluted version, it's a rags to riches story. And literary studies, we know that this rags to riches is a very you can read it in a lot of ways. It's not just US centric, but you can read it alongside the American dream and this idea that if you are lucky enough and fortunate enough, and if you work hard enough, then and you make all the right choices, then you too can gain enough power and wealth, and accumulate enough that you are at the top, you are at the elite class. And so I think in that way, that book, at its like foundational narrative, it cannot be pleasure activism. Maybe that's not always true, but I think that's one way that I would definitely critique that. As well as there's a lot of ethical problems that you could pick apart, not only with the author herself, but with this idea, this particular group of the members of the night court are like somehow moralistic, like victorious good guys who like
Yeah.
campaign against evil. There's something about that I think that is also troubling. I do think it's compelling that you enjoyed it the first time around. I did too. I loved these books. And I'm not saying that there's nothing there that you can't take from it. Like, without sharing too much of this other person's story, he has drug addiction issues, and he read through. You haven't read it yet, but it's A Court of Silver Flames, which have
Oh,
to
I've
do with
read it. Yeah.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
okay. So you read the okay. He was talking about how much that helped him with his
Nesta
own
story.
addiction, and yeah,
Yeah.
Nesta's story. And I do think, like, I don't want to dismiss people like that who have very real responses to the stories, because I too had that. But I think that when you put a kind of critical lens on it, is it feminist? I would say no.
Yeah.
But I don't know that that means that you can't enjoy it or take
Yeah.
different things from it, right?
Totally. So the second one that
Yeah.
you said was potentially an example of pleasure activism was Bride. So tell us a little bit about why that one could count.
Yes. So when I answered with that, it's because I was thinking of the anti kind of speciesism that is a part of this book, and by that I mean that humans are not the center of this world, and I think that there's something compelling about that, and it's, I think, a really interesting investigation of power, because it is a hierarchical kind of world, but the main characters end up being incredibly critical of that and attempting to kind of undo it. But I mean, there are limits to the romantasy genre, especially when it comes to like werewolves and mates, because there will always be this kind of alpha leader
Mhm.
guy, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know how much we could call it pleasure activism, but I think if anything gets close, it does have to do with maybe a kind of anti-speciesism that you can read into as a kind of anti-racism. There's a lot of self-determination. The main character is used as a political tool it's how she gets involved with the werewolves. Her father kind of puts her up as collateral. I mean, they call her collateral. She eventually makes her own way out of this collateral kind of mold that she's been raised in, and ends up being able to make decisions about her own life. And I think in that way it can try to be this empowering mode that like Feyre and Violet are attempting to do as well. And I think that one other thing that is really, really important, and I'd be interested in your thoughts if Fourth Wing or Akatar do this as well, but consent. I think that a lot of these books are attempting to make consent sexy and attempting to advocate for men asking women if they are okay with what is happening or checking in as sex is happening. And this book has really great examples of what that could look like. And I think in doing that, it's trying to promote consent within our like everyday lives.
I really like that read. I have several thoughts. The first of which is like, I do love the idea of a very popular genre doing that, like make consent sexy, because maybe people who would not, like people who are not thinking about feminism or consent or rape culture, like maybe they just enjoy a good book, and and then they internalize this sort of sexual script that like,
Mhm.
oh, that's normal. A partner should be asking me, a partner should be checking in, a partner should make sure I'm enjoying what's happening.
Right.
But the book I think of when I think of make consent sexy is, oh gosh, what's it called? Okay, I'm in my Google search bar, I've typed book talk, dubious consent, hacker, stalking. Okay, it's called Lights Out by
Okay.
Navessa Allen. And literally like the content warnings for the book is wild. But one of them is that phrase of dubious consent. And so throughout the book, it's this idea of like, oh, he's stalking her, he's hacking her, she's not aware, he's watching her through these hidden cameras or whatever. But part of the plot too is it's a role play fantasy scenario for both of them, because she does consent to it and he asks her several times throughout this extended role play thing they have going on, like, are you actually okay with that? Like, I wouldn't want to overstep a boundary. And she's like, yes, I want you to. And then they revert back to the like, oh no, I can't believe he's watching me. So that's the book I think of, because I know a lot of people on Book talk about like how it's a dark fantasy or dark romance. Fantasy is not the right word, but a dark stalker romance. And then when I read it, I was like, oh, this is gonna get weird. I don't know how I'm gonna feel. And then I was like, oh, this is just two people with a kink who found each other. Happy ending. Like, I'm happy for them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you brought that up because I feel like now we're talking about not romantasy, but like more realism, like
Yeah.
smut books that are in the real world. Because I've read a lot more of that. And when we were having this conversation, I thought of two books that do this as well. One is Katie Roberts' Desperate Measures, and it's very much centers around dubious non-consent. But the edition that I got had her annotations in it. She was able to publish like little notes that were like, oh, this is where I thought that he was taking away consent from her. But when you read it, he actually is asking for her consent, but it's like a game that they're both in
Mm.
on together. And so that was like really interesting. And then it also made me think of K.A. Knight's Den of Vipers, which I think is like if there's a canon of smut and dark romance, this is in it, and it's a reverse harem, which means that the female main character ends up with and has sex with multiple men, and they all become her partner. And so I think that would I call that book feminist? No, but does it have like this anti-compulsory monogamy element that's compelling? Yeah, it does. And I think that that's really interesting. And so does Lindsay Straub's Kiss of the Basilisk or Split or Swallow. And so I think that there's ways that these books have elements of feminism, but they are not wholesale feminist, if that makes any sense.
It does make sense. A question that's come up for me as we're having this conversation is I feel like many books in many genres play with all of these themes that we're talking about. But the thing that in my head, smut, so whether that's romantasy or realist fiction or like whatever the genre, the subgenre within smut is, the common thing, at least that I've seen, is very explicit narration about sex. And I'm just wondering like how that factors in. Like, is that the part that people are really interested in or enjoy? Because I feel like you could read a YA book and it
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't have like the explicit descriptions, say that like Kiss of the Basilisk has. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so why do those only show up in these ones? Does this question make sense?
I think it kind of does, but I probably won't answer it directly because when I was thinking about this, I was also kind of questioning like, what are the different kinds of smut that are not genre narrative based, but around sex?
Mhm.
And we now have this word called spice, right? Which is not something that I had growing up. Instead, we called it lemon. I don't know if you ever were like tuned
No.
in. Yeah, it's called like lemon. And it's where the narratives, no matter what is happening, sex is at the center of the story. So we might call it high spice, or we might call it lemon, or yeah, smut. And then there are other books, like you're saying, that have explicit sex scenes, like Game of Thrones. Sex is described in detail in Game of Thrones, but it
Yeah,
does not dominate the series. And nobody would call Game of Thrones smut.
yeah.
There are other ones like the fifth season by N.K. Jemisin also has like sex described, but you would never call it smut. There's also like the cozy genre, like the Pumpkin Spice Cafe, like kind of
Mhm.
series. It also has sex, but is not smut. I also read this book called The Late Bloomer. It's a lesbian, cozy lesbian romance. And sex is deeply, like, detailed description, and yet it doesn't seem like it's smut either. And then when it comes to YA, there's this kind of term called closed door romance or fade to black. And I think
Mhm.
Twilight is a really good example of it, where it's all about the romance and the love between two characters. But when they actually have sex, you don't see it. It literally fades to black. And then you have the open door romance, which goes into erotica. A fan fiction term for this is porn without plot. And then also the classic like bodice rippers,
Yeah.
right? Which, small tangent, my late dad confessed to me like in his like later years that he used to read bodice rippers when he was like at work, and he used to
Oh
work
my
at construction sites. So I don't know what that says
I love that
either
mental
about,
image.
I know, about what it offers, but it's so interesting to me that there are different levels at which sex is put into the narrative from the storytelling perspective, but the words on the page as well, the detailed parts of it. And for me, I think that the detailed scenes are something that I found helpful growing up. Like, it becomes a form of sex education. At least it did
Yeah.
when I was reading Rebecca York's New Moon. And probably these aren't the best places for sex education, but I did grow up in a Texas public school. And so I did not have a
I
lot of
feel
it,
that.
anyways. And so I think that there's something about the explicit detail that is compelling for many different audiences, and we can keep kind of pulling at the threads of what audiences and why. But that's my answer to your question. I don't know if I fully got at it though.
I love that answer to that question because it is like literally coming from a literature professor because I could not even put together what I was trying to articulate. And you were like, yeah, girl, I got you. Let me talk for a moment.
Which is funny because this is the most unscholarly literary topic. Like, there are not a lot of people who write about this topic in the actual field of literature. It's not serious.
Which is wild to me that in 2025 there are still scholars out there that would interpret this as not serious.
Right. Not worth writing about.
And maybe it's just because of the type of work I do and the type of literature for my research that I'm engaged in, but like the fact that there would still be scholars who's like, that's not serious scholarship. Like, I'm like, oh wow, okay, bold.
And there are people who write about sex. There are in like who publish with MLA or PMLA or like all these different very highly valued kind of publication presses and sites, but nobody's writing about ACOTAR in these places, especially because it's considered popular culture. And that comes with its own sort of baggage, scholarly baggage in particular. So you'll find spaces that do that, but for the most part, you're not reading people who are super invested in deconstructing the Omegaverse with like werewolves and alphas and and all these different things, right?
I find that so unfortunate, especially in a world where I feel like people who are not in academic spaces are curious about what goes on in academic spaces. And then, like, for example, the institution that we're at, there's funding behind, like, take your scholarship public. So I'm
Yeah.
like, why wouldn't people want to meet people where they're at, and if where people are at is on book talk talking about fairy fucking, like, let's go. Let's go talk about it.
It's true. I do think that a part of the conversation we haven't hit on, but is a part of this, is money. Because book talk makes a lot of people money. If you can go viral on book talk, then you can sell thousands of copies of
Yeah.
your book. Which is like what publishers are calling the power of book talk. And I think it's scary to them, to be honest, that they don't have as much control over the book market as maybe they once did. However, I do think that because these books make money with a particular female audience, usually straight, that they really see it as almost like like a literary sellout.
Yeah,
If that's like a term.
which again, just echoing earlier, how unfortunate. And again, like, I think we're probably in agreement here. We can talk more about it in a bit of like, well, no, this is not like at the forefront of feminism, but it's doing something. It's serving some
Yeah.
purposes sometimes. So, crazy
Well,
behavior to keep writing stuff off.
yeah. Well, it's very performative, I think. It's
Mm.
like, I think an attempt to be, when you're publishing on stuff, be seen in a certain kind of way. And
Yeah.
I think, I don't know. I'm thinking in like 12 different ways. But one thing I also wanted to talk about is fan fiction, because I think a lot of our books that we're talking about, some of them even began in fan
Yeah.
fiction.
Mhm.
And that's somewhere where I began and then moved towards. And it's somewhere that scholars also are very like what's the word for it? Dismissive. Scholars are very dismissive of fan fiction, and it has a reputation of being terrible, and it kind of has the route of like self-publication, because you don't have like editors or people that vet it for
Oh, no, there
quality.
wasn't a gatekeeper?
And there's no gatekeeping, and so it's heavily dismissed. But I
Yeah.
think that's a part of the conversation here too.
Gosh, I feel like we could keep talking forever, and we have in the past, and we will in the future, I'm sure. Okay, so I wanna bring us to try and answer our question. But
Yeah.
is it feminist? Are these books feminist? And you've already sort of given us instances of where you think they can be, or where it would be extremely challenging to interpret that as feminist. But if you had like a student ask you, how might you answer that question?
With great care.
Yeah.
I would say no, not inherently. These books are not feminist. I think that they have great potential to include a feminist ethics. Like I said, in kind of pieces, some things that we've talked about that are part of this feminist ethic that they might include are this validation and satisfying narrative of consent culture. I do think self determination still has some feminist ethics, especially if it comes along with some kind of self awareness of yourself as an individual within a broader system.
Yeah.
Um, things that other kind of feminist ethics that these books might include are to be anti-capitalist or anti-shame around pleasure, also anti-hierarchical, anti-speciesism, anti-racism even, and then anti-compulsory monogamy, so kind of embracing a more polygamous, consensual polygamous understanding of love and sex. But I do think my answer is no, not inherently, because just as frequently the tropes and the narratives that these stories are told in uphold compulsory heterosexuality.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of non-heterosexual stories being told in these genres. You've already covered this in an episode, but girl boss feminism is very Feyre and Violet coded, right?
Yeah.
Um, I also think there's something that we don't have time to unpack, but respectability politics, I think, plays a role here. Um, who has the body and the performance to be held as respectable is something that a lot of these books are invested in, as well as something
Mm.
we might call traditional femininity. And then we haven't gotten a lot into race, but there's definitely an uncritical whiteness at the center of a lot of these books that would probably take a long time to unpack. But I think ultimately sex is an exchange of power that includes vulnerability and intimacy and respect, and even if you're spiritual, a kind of metaphysical soul connection. And because it has all of these incredibly significant pieces to it, it has the potential to be both feminist and not, sometimes even at the same time.
Gosh, I'm gonna be thinking about that all day today. Possibly even tomorrow. I feel like, and this was part of the reason that I felt so compelled to, or what inspired me rather, to even do this podcast, is because I was part of a group called Sacred Rights, and it was like a 2-month training program for scholars in religion about how to take your work public, how to share with people about what you're working on. And on the very last day, our facilitator asked the question of like, what is the one question that you keep coming back to? Like, what is the thing you fall asleep thinking about at night? Like, you can't even get it off your mind. And for me, that question was, but is it feminist? Like, everywhere I look, I'm like, how can it, you can interpret that either way. You can interpret it any way you need to.
Yeah.
And so the fact that like we're even ending on that note, for me personally resonates because this genre, because it is dealing so intimately with sex, like in everything you just said, of it has the potential to be feminist or to not. But the really interesting thing to me is that more often than not, it's doing them both at the same time. Like,
Yeah.
I think that's just fascinating and why I'm so invested in thinking about feminism all the time.
I love this concept as a podcast. I've already told you this in person, so you can feel free to cut this out when you start your editing process. But it's incredibly compelling, this question. And I also come back to it. I think a lot of people come back to it, even if they don't use the word feminist,
Mm,
they're coming back to the core of the question, which means, is there something ethical or moral or liberatory in this thing that I'm consuming and finding joy from?
yeah.
And the fact that you're asking this question, like I did a little, I think, again, I already told this, you can cut all this out, but I did a little bit of research beforehand on podcasts that were talking about smut or romantasy. And they're talking about it in a lot of different ways within capitalism, within like, why do women like it? Is it porn? Stuff like that. But nobody's asking this exact question. And that means that you are making an intervention, a really important one. And so I think this podcast is brilliant. I think you are brilliant. And I love that it exists.
Sonia. I don't like crying on Thursdays.
Only
That's
on
not
Thursdays.
my scheduled crying time. Can't squeeze it in. Sonia, thank you so much for having this conversation with me, because this has exceeded every single expectation I had for this conversation. And I will, like I said, be thinking about it for a long time, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for holding this space. It's important.